I'm Dan Schiffer, and I'm Director of Public Programs and Write-in-Residence at the Contemporary Jewish Museum, and it is my pleasure to introduce Susan Hiller, our artist, in from London. We are trying out some new stools. If you see us moving around strangely, we are just starting our second year in this space, and we're still kind of adding furniture and things like that. So we're going to try to stay focused on conversation. If it's not working, I feel like I'm going to spin around. Yeah. You are looking at the J.Street Project, Susan Hiller's photographic odyssey through contemporary Germany. It's really an extraordinary work that we will have a chance to talk about at some length. The gallery includes this grid of 303 photos, this list of cities over here, a map of Germany, a film that is not on right now but will be on while when the program finishes, and then a resource room with information about Germany and so forth. So we're going to have a short conversation. We'd like this to be somewhat informal, and we'd like to invite people to ask questions and raise hands and not be shy. We just want to have a good talk. I want to introduce Susan Hiller a little more formally, and then we're going to start our conversation proper. Susan Hiller's work has appeared in galleries around the world, including London's Institute of Contemporary Art, the Tate Liverpool, the Jewish Museum in New York, the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia, among many others. She just told me yesterday that she will be having a retrospective at the Tate in London next year, which is really extraordinary. So if you happen to be in London next year, please see that show. She has taught at UCLA and the University of Newcastle, among many other places. And her work is somewhat impossible to categorize in the sense that she's worked with film, photography, writing, painting, performance, video, projections, and found objects. And I'd like to, when we talk, I'd like to ask her a little bit more about this issue of how she's able to work in so many media. Susan Hiller has described her art as a kind of archaeological investigation, uncovering something to make a different kind of sense of it. And she once described the collection of objects from her exhibition from the Freud Museum as concentrating on work that is unspoken, unrecorded, unexplained, and overlooked. And I'd like to return to that phrase in a couple of minutes. I thought it would be useful for us just to start, for you to talk just a little bit about kind of what this is. More specifically, how did you find yourself in Germany for 3 years, and why did you decide to spend those 3 years taking all these photographs?
Okay. Well, I can start with the simple part. I was in Germany. I was invited to go to Germany on an artist sort of fellowship. There's maybe this isn't turned on. Can you hear this?
This is just for the
That's
camera.
just for the video, so we have to talk louder. Okay. I was invited on an artist fellowship to Berlin on a program that's been going since the 50s, I think, when Berlin was a divided city and was very isolated, and they had this policy of inviting artists from other countries to come to keep people there in touch with what was happening culturally outside of Germany. And so I had really not been in Berlin before, and I'd only been in Germany very, very briefly. And I was walking around the city one day, with a map in one hand and looking for where I was, and I looked up, and the corner of the street I was standing on was called Judenstrasse, which means Jews Street. And I was completely sort of taken aback by that. I was surprised, to say the least, and sort of shocked and a bit confused about what this meant. This sign talking about these people that had been exterminated, basically. Why was there this street sign in Germany? And what did it mean? And it got me sort of wondering and thinking and so forth. And I went back home and looked in we decided there's not a name for this. In Europe, most big cities have a book which is a list of every street, so you can look up the street and then you can go to a map and find it. So I looked in this book for Berlin, and I discovered there were several other Judenstrasses in Berlin, not just this one, but others as well. And that led to even more questions. And then after that, I decided I had to do some kind of work around this. And my husband and I started doing research. When I say research, I mean a very simple kind of research. We went through every single map of Germany that listed every single street in every single town, and we got this list together of these 303 places.
If that's simple, I'm wondering what complicated would be.
Well, complicated, no, okay, this is an interesting thing too. Complicated might be historical research, really getting into how the streets came to be named like that and what that implied and what the situation was. Was it a ghetto? Was it not a ghetto? You know, that kind of really deep historical research. I'm not a historian, I didn't do that. But it became a sort of pilgrimage, you know, to go to these places and to record them because nobody had ever done this before, which sort of shocked me once I discovered that there were such places. There is no list. This is it. This is the list, the 303 places. Now, at one time, there were clearly more. These are old names. These names are all streets that were called Judenstrasse or Judengasse or whatever before World War II. And of course, the Nazis took all those names away and replaced them with names of things they thought were acceptable or people they wanted to celebrate. Then after the war, in the denazification process, whereby the Allies put a huge amount of effort into changing the German education system and kind of trying to cleanse it from top to bottom of these fascist tendencies, they simply got rid of all the Nazi street names and they put the old street names back. So these streets are pre-war. And there clearly were more of them at one time, because even as we were going around the country filming and photographing the 303 streets, we would get to a place where the map said there should be such a street, and the name was changed to something else. Well, you know, street names change all the time. And the streets quite often are very old streets in the center of town someplace, and it's being redone or putting new streets in, and so the street name goes. In fact, the film shows a process, and one of the photographs does too, the street going the other way, where the Judenstrasse name is being restored. Even so many years after the war, they're still trying to denazify. So anyway, I'm jumping around. So that was the beginning of the project. Okay.
I'm curious, as you were taking photographs and videos, whether people in those cities and on those streets were curious as to what you were doing. I imagine they were. And if so, whether these street names for them were merely just this white visual noise in the background, or whether it was something that they really thought of and saw as an important cultural artifact.
Yeah, that's a very interesting thing. You know, you read out something I wrote about my work, and I think that one of my obsessions with these street signs is that they're ghosts. They're there. They're perfectly visible, but nobody sees them. And this is true of street signs everywhere, but in this case, possibly more so. So it's, on the one hand, an unconscious memorial. Nobody intended to leave these traces of memory, but they're there. And I think that the people who live on them have a wide range of opinions. And actually, we didn't get a chance to talk to many people about it because so many of these places are little tiny places in the country and there's nobody around. When we did have conversations with people, they varied tremendously. We had one conversation with a woman that you might consider this a slightly anti-Semitic thing. We said, "Do you know anything about the name of your street?" And she said, "Yes, rich people used to live here," she said. So that was really the only negative remark that we had, because we had some very positive things. I mean, in one little town, tiny little village, that had been reincorporated into a bigger, like a county. And somebody from the local government had come around and said they wanted to change all the style of their street signs in this little village so that they matched, the other things. And apparently they had said to this man that we were talking to something like, well, it's not such a nice name, this street, would you like to change it? And he said, no, we've always lived on Judenstrasse, this is our street, and we're going to keep the name. Whether he had any sense of what it referred to is not part of the conversation. And I think the only comparable thing that we would know, maybe experience, is, there are a lot of Native American place names all over this country. And do we think about that very much, And so that's really one of the chilling aspects of this, is that the Holocaust was not very long ago, and Germans are very conscious of it in school and in every other way officially. But on the level of the everyday unconsciousness of everyone, it means nothing. So the thing is balanced on that kind of edge, really, and that, to me, is the disturbing element. Yeah.
Maybe just to go a little further into the history, I know that I'd like to focus, I think we both want to focus more on the art and the process and going too far into German Jewish history, but we had a conversation the other day that stuck with me about history in Germany being so present, and the country being kind of burdened with it in a way, that for artists there's actually tremendous material to work with. But I was also wondering whether if a country is too congested with history, that it's hard for artists or others to get a fresh lens on it. So I'm just...
Yes. I mean, Germany is exactly as you said. I mean, you can hardly go anywhere without being reminded of something historical, whether it's the former division of Germany and the Cold War, or whether it goes back to World War II, or whether it goes before that even. It's a very significant part of our inheritance, if you like, even though we're not Germans, So I don't know what it's like to be German. I think that because they have such an exposure in the schools to all of this, it's easy to forget. I don't know if that's just a short answer to this. I think that they have not got a lot of experience of Jews as ordinary people living amongst them in a normal way. They only have a historical notion, and that's very strange.
A little bit abstract.
Very abstract. That's exactly right. And it is a source of tremendous inspiration to artists. I don't know a single artist who's ever gone to Germany who hasn't produced some kind of work, almost as if we have to get it out of our system in a way. But it's very hard to find a fresh take on the Jewish tragedy. And I wanted to make a work that was a sort of commemoration of an absence, but that was done in a very cool, sort of minimal way, to leave the emotional response up to the viewer to construct from their own personal memory, if you like.
Maybe that's a good segue into the response of visitors to this work. I'm wondering, as an artist, whether you had an intention, or whether once it was done you had a sense that there was an arc of engagement, so to speak, that you would hope or expect or believe visitors would, I don't know what the verb is, go through. What would you imagine people would feel when they saw this grid? What would be the
Well, I would
process
think
by
they
which-
would first think it was a very sort of logical, rational format, which it is, but the way that I would interpret that is a logical framework for a very explosive kind of subject matter. At the same time, I attempted to keep my photographs and film ordinary, like in the realm of the ordinary kind of picture that you might take yourself of a place. I didn't want to use filters or lighting. I didn't want to make it look like a tragedy had occurred. I wanted the everydayness of the place where tragedy happens to be on the surface of the image. And so the rest is up to us to fill in for ourselves. And I guess I see it as an opportunity to meditate on an absence, and also possibly to help us to think about subsequent attempts to eliminate minority cultures in other parts of the world, terrible attempts at so-called ethnic cleansing, which seems to be an awful sort of possibility for human beings to think of other human beings in this way. And it made me wonder whether, everyone talks about what should be learned from the Holocaust, whether anybody's learned anything, because it keeps happening in other ways, never to the scale and the organization of the German situation, but certainly that tendency is present. So, all these kind of thoughts might be triggered off by people looking at this work. I don't know whether it is or not. It's not for me to say. Somebody want to ask something?
Yes, please.
Just a basic question. Do some of these 300 images come from the former East? And if so, can you characterize any difference in your experience in making these photos into
Something.
Sorry, did everyone hear the question? Whether these photos are... We don't have a microphone for this gallery, but maybe for our next event we will. I think I'll repeat all the questions. Whether these 303 photos are taken from both East and West Germany, and if so, whether there's any difference between those two regions and what you found.
They are taken from both. It's everything. One of the reasons it took such a long time to finish this project was because we were waiting for the new maps of the East to be put in the same format with each street name as they had been in former West Germany. And there are, of course, a tremendous abundance of these places toward the east of the country, toward Poland, and also down in the south toward Switzerland, where they actually overlap into what's now Switzerland. But I wanted to concentrate on Germany for, just the borders of contemporary Germany for obvious reasons. And I think in the former East, I know that the official policy was to define the East, to define the DDR as anti-fascist by definition, so therefore there was supposedly a more tolerant view toward the Jewish population, but I don't actually think from this project that you can see any difference. There was a scattering over the country of different histories depending on long ago policies of settlement and so forth, and I think that was pretty evenly distinguished more by former provinces of Germany than by the East-West border. No, it's just, this again, it goes along with this attempt at a cool kind of handling. They're just alphabetical. The list, this kind of traditional commemoration of names in a list, is numbered. And those numbers refer to the photographs. They each have a number. I don't know if you can see them from where you are, but they each have a number.
They're alphabetical.
Yes. And then the map, again, the numbers, you can find the place on the map. And I said to somebody last night that it's a old-fashioned kind of interaction. You might have to move from one place to the other. But you might go on a quest for a particular place and you could locate it in either way.
So in a visual sense, they're random.
Yes, they are. Yeah.
Do you have a question?
Do you have any idea originally why these streets were named J.Street? Was that something as a segregation?
Well, that's the okay.
Repeat the question.
Yeah.
Do we know historically why these streets had Jew attached to them in some way?
Well, first let me say something just again briefly about the history. The names go back to the 11th century. Okay, the Jews were in Germany from the 4th century. They came with the Romans. And so there were Jewish settlements in Germany very early on. You can see on the map the settlement patterns followed the rivers to a large extent.
It was semi-ghettos.
Some were ghettos, but some were not ghettos.
It was semi.
Semi-ghettos.
Not always, actually. See, this is, I'm not a historian. The whole thing about ghettos is, again, problematic because we think of the ghettos that the Nazis made. Some ghettos were Jewish neighborhoods, and the Jews, to protect themselves at certain times, would put up a wall and hire a watchman so that nobody could get at them during the night. It wasn't always that they were locked in, so the word ghetto is confusing anyway, because it's come to mean so many different things. But in many cases, it simply refers to a street that had Jewish people living on it. In the Middle Ages, they named streets a Goldsmith Street, Church Street, Synagogue Street. They named it for a feature. So the Jews lived there, it was the Jew Street. Didn't mean they had to live there, you see. But it changed. In different times and different periods, it changed. And there are some very tragic names, of course. There are so many country places, including 3 or 4 towns, by the way, that are called Jews Village or Jews Town, which you can see if you look. But there are a lot of roads in the country that are named Judenpfad, Jews Path, or so forth. They don't all have street signs, but they're named on the map. And those are sometimes they evoke very terrible times in Germany when Jews were not allowed to walk through settled areas, and they had to keep moving. They couldn't be any place for longer than 3 years. They all became peddlers, and they would have to walk around all these little villages. So now, of course, these are beautiful romantic paths through the forest or over the hills or whatever. But those are all, those refer to a very unfortunate period in German history. So.
I think you're implying this when you say that some streets are called Synagogue Street, but I think probably you could have a much longer list that included not just Judengasse, Judenstrasse, but also streets that were somehow identified with Jews that didn't have that word.
You could, but I didn't want to deal with that. I felt that it was the shocking thing was the naming of an absence. The fact, okay, a sign in linguistics is a sign stands for something that isn't there. And these street signs do that doubly. I mean, they're saying the word over and over and over again of something that isn't there. It becomes, to me, and this is part of my artistic decision, if you like, it's like a litany or a meditation on a word, on an absence. That repetition over and over again for me was really important. But you're right, of course. Could have made it bigger.
May I ask you a question about your process? In the film,
Yeah.
you choose to linger on some of the signs or the environment, and others you pass through quickly.
Yeah.
How did you, what was it that helped you make that decision
Yeah.
in your editing?
Well, the film is really a slow meditation on a word. It's quite a conceptual film. There's always something in the sequence that determines the length of the shot. Sometimes I think, I was testing the viewer's patience. How long can you look at this and think about it, But I can give you some examples. For example, there's one scene, the sign says Judengasse, and it's on top of a clock. And the clock hand is going round, and I let it go 1 minute exactly. It clicks, 1 minute. And you realize how long 1 minute is. It's a very, very long time in a film and in life, and that's sort of a deliberate decision. Or another place, the sun is going down, so I let it go. You have to sit through the whole sunset. And others, well, there's one scene, there's a chicken goes across the road, so I let the whole chicken go. I let the chicken crosses the road. That's what determines the length of the shot, So there's something like that in everyone.
If I could just ask the question, Ad, and then we'll make sure we get everyone's questions. Sitting here, I am aware of these 303 photographic images, a map, a list of names, and then the film, which is in this room, but which is not on now. And it's just interesting to think about 4 different ways of conceptually and visually expressing something similar in a way. And I'm wondering first, the interplay between the static images and the moving images, whether you thought about doing those two things in parallel in some way, and also once we're here in the gallery and we have those things, how do you think these four modes of representation are in conversation?
Well, I mean, these three are really in conversation in the way that I suggested. I mean, they reference each other. You didn't mention the book, of course. The book,
Sorry.
which attempts to use yet another format. Well, you could say it's a sign of disturbance. I mean, I have to keep saying the same thing in different ways. I mean, that would be, you know, an unfortunate psychological thing, but I think it's true, actually. You know, this is a sign of, there's no way you can describe this. There's no simple form of representation. But I think that there's, you know, on a more conceptual level, the film is organized by seasons of the year. It's different to this kind of, if you like, bureaucratic kind of situation. And the difference between a moving image and a still image is, of course, very profound. And the photographs are all in portrait format, yeah? So the idea is like a picture, a portrait of a place. The film is shot in a landscape format and has movement in it. It doesn't freeze a moment in the same way that this does. It implies a kind of ongoingness, and I think the everyday ongoingness of life as it goes from the history to the present is kind of conveyed differently in the film than the photographs. Yeah. It's just conceptual things.
Great.
Yeah.
Do you have a question before? Do you have a question?
I just wanted to add a footnote about the question about other streets that have other Jewish connotations, and to say that in Germany, for example, they memorialize many Anne Frank streets, for example. As the very remarkable streets. Maybe, I think, traveling around Germany, there are 20 or 30 different Anne Frank streets. It's simply something that I think Susan didn't want to deal with.
You didn't want the Anne Frank Street Project.
No, that's right. There are this. I was saying that the Judenstrasses, like the Synagoguestrasses or the Abrahamstrasses and so forth, are old names. New attempts to commemorate in a very positive sense that are made by a community that wants to put a street sign up for the Jews who had once lived there. They would do an Anne Frank Street or a Chaim Weizmann Street, something like that. But they would never, ever have a Judenstrasse because it's not a very nice street name. Jew Street is not polite. And there are nuances of language. Quite a few streets are called Am Juden Friedhof, to the Jews' cemetery. That's not very polite. If you wanted to be polite, you would say Am Jüdischen, to the Jewish cemetery. Do you see? So there are all these language things. Yeah.
So a few more questions. Maybe we'll just go counterclockwise, please.
Has this exhibit been in Germany, or do you plan to have it exhibited in
It
Germany?
has been. It was in Germany. The film was first in the DAAD gallery in Berlin, and then just very recently, I was invited to show the whole project in a similar way to this in the Bundestag gallery in Berlin, which is it was a big honor, you know, because that is the government art exhibiting place, very, very central and so forth. But as far as the reaction goes, I would say there's been very little. I mean, of course, I had very nice reviews and all of that, but it didn't seem to I keep saying this, I may be wrong, but I feel that people in Germany they've had enough of discussion of this, and I don't think they want much more. And the fact that there is this really amazing commemoration all around the country perhaps doesn't seem that interesting to people. In fact, people were surprised in many of the little towns that we went to that there were other streets of this name. They thought they had the only one in their little town. And I found that very interesting too. Yeah, but I have had the opportunity to show it there. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about your naming of this exhibit? Because it has these other, I mean, there's this J.Street Project, and it has these different connotations. So if you could talk about the context of your naming this
Well, do you want to say something about the what you feel the connotations are?
Well, I mean, it's been used in this kind of, hip Jewish identity thing in America, J.Street Project. I mean, some of my colleagues know more about this than I do. And so it's very kind of, so when I saw the sign, that was the first set of associations I had, so I didn't.
You mean this political group? Well, this was named first, I have to say. So that takes care of that. And I think it's just an interesting coincidence. In fact, I believe that we tried to contact them to say, why are you using my name? But we didn't get a response. But they have written here saying, why are you using our name? Which is all very silly and funny at the same time. But the actual reason, and it is interesting that you brought this up, because of course the J was stamped on Jews' passports.
What did this lady say?
Oh, yes.
I'm sorry. She was the J Street. I don't know what's the formal title of the J.Street Project is. It's a liberal lobbying group in Washington related to Israel and Jewish issues, and so there was some interesting confusion about why that group and this exhibition had the same name. So we were wondering about that. Purely a coincidence, if you believe in coincidence. Yeah, in the back. Yeah.
I'm intrigued by what you describe this as kind of portraiture. Again, there are very few photographs that have people in them. And I'm wondering if that was intentional. You were hoping that people looking at you would imagine themselves. Photographs is, again, a way of entering a very ordinary space. I don't want to put words in your mouth, I'd rather have
The question is whether the relative lack of people in these portraits, why would they be called portraits or portraiture, and was that intentional?
Well, there aren't many people there because there weren't many people around. There are more people in the film because the set shots have longer duration, and there was time for people to appear or usually rush away. Basically, they didn't really want to be in the picture. But that wasn't intentional. I think your idea is very interesting, that with an absence of people, we can put ourselves in the picture. And that's why I don't want to say too much about interpretation, because your interpretation is fascinating. That never occurred to me. So, yeah. And I don't want to, make my interpretation be your interpretation. Yeah.
Please.
asking my second question. This is a question in terms of just the visual presentation of the portraits. I don't have great eyesight, so I always have this issue with museums, is that something is above my eye level. I don't see
Yeah.
it. And then here we have a lot of things that are below the average, the eye level, the average height person, and a lot above. So, and also because now we're sitting in these chairs, I'm looking at this as a whole piece. And I'm just wondering, did you think about that when you decided to display them all?
No, I knew they would be like that. I knew they would be like that. Oh, sorry, you have to. Yeah.
The question is, why were the pictures laid out in this way, some low, some higher? Not all of them would be visible to every person in terms of their height, and whether there was a reason or rationale behind that.
Well, I did make a book, which we haven't talked about, which has every single one of the pictures in in what I happen to like books a lot, and I think they remain a perfect format that's never been improved for accessibility. And with the book, you can pick it up at the back or the front. You can start in the middle. The order is not entirely determined by my ordering of it. And the book is another part of the work. It's another way of getting into the work. So I think that I did think about it unless I made the book.
I would very much like to talk about the book. What should we talk about?
We talk about books. I don't know.
Right, the book is in a way the fifth of the pieces in this gallery, although as you say, it exists separately in terms of accessibility. Is there something else about the book? Is there an experience of looking at the book and reading the book that offers something different than the
I think it offers an intimacy. I think it offers an intimacy. The physical touching that you can do with a book is different. And we have, when we read, we are in the picture. I mean, there's no gap, is there? And when you look at a book of pictures, you look at the pictures differently than when you look at them on the wall. And I like that very much. And I was also able to put into the book all the information that's here. I mean, there's the map, there's the list, and there's additional material as well. For example, this material that's in the resource room, the translations of the street names, you know, whether they mean Jew's Path or Jew's Pond or Jew's Acre, all these sorts of things, that's all in the book. And it's not separated out spatially, you know. It's entirely up to you how you want to use all that. There's also an interesting introduction, I think it's called an introduction, by a young German art critic whose take on all of this is very interesting, I think.
We have time for 2 more questions, and then we'll be able to talk a little bit informally as well. But I want to make sure I get everyone in at least. Boy, all right. We'll do the best we can.
Okay, so one of the questions that immediately arises from looking at these is who named these streets? Obviously a question that's historical, but because we don't know, you know, is this named by the Jews themselves? Is it named by others, thus leaving the Jews as it were passive in this process and you know, objects of observation by others? And so it occurred to me that actually it's interesting that in modern Yiddish, the term Yiddish Agas means not just a Jewish street, but it means the Jewish public.
Yeah, yeah.
And so in the Eastern European context, it has a very different kind of, I mean, it is the sense of Jews taking on agency because it's used as
The public.
part of Jewish politics.
Yeah, we get that in the newspapers, but not so much the Arab street, like public opinion. Yes, a community. It defines, what would you, yeah, public opinion. That's now that's a very interesting question, and I can't answer that because I know that the streets acquired those names at very different historical moments in different places. Now, clearly, if it was a ghetto that people were forced to live in, then they didn't name it themselves, maybe. But one of the streets I know that the name goes back to the Roman period. Oh, I have to explain this a little bit. There's a town called Trier down in the, yeah, and it's a very, very, very old city that was settled by the Romans. And there is a photograph here of Trier, which I think sums up quite a lot. It's a street, actually, the center of the picture is a beauty salon. And then there are 2 street signs. And one is Karl Marx Strasse, and one is Judentenmeerstrasse. And Karl Marx was born on that street, and that's why it's been named after him. And then on the other side is, what is Judentenmeerstrasse? Well, it means something like Ad Burum Judi. It means the Jews living along the wall street. And I think that would have just acquired that through usage, you know. The Jews lived along the wall, that's the Jews living along the wall street, you know. As I think it would be a fascinating research project for somebody.
Please. Oh, I just want to have one of our teams, and then I'll.
I was just wondering, now that you've kind of completed this project, do you feel accomplished as if you expose like an ordinary portrayal of streets?
Do I feel that I've accomplished? I don't quite understand.
Do you feel a sense of accomplishment? Do you mean, okay, if I could elaborate on the question a little bit, I mean, my interpretation of the question is whether or not you feel that you've done what was set out to do, whether the project is completed or whether there's more still to do, or whether there's a sense of artistic accomplishment at this piece of work?
No, I still feel the kind of restlessness about the ambiguity. I mean, a psychic restlessness. All these questions of who named them, what did it mean, become an obsession, actually. And I've gone on sort of researching other countries, other places. I mean, France has many of these streets, and Switzerland and Cuba and, you know, everywhere. And we know that it's not the same as Germany. I mean, I'm not going to make a project out of it, but I'm just very, very interested in the widespread history, yeah, and the traces that are left. But I keep saying it's not the same as Germany, where people were eliminated deliberately. This is a very special case, the Germans. But of course, I'm happy that I did it. It doesn't make me feel that I understand what happened any more than I did before, but I have done much more thinking about it. Yeah.
How about our final question, please?
Oh, it's a comment and a question. I was recently in Europe, and I think that, and in France, where we went to a couple places that used to be synagogues. I was in Spain years ago with a cousin of my husband who was a victim of the Holocaust. She survived, luckily. She's still alive. And we went around looking at all the Jewish places, in Spain, many of them from the Inquisition, so that, you know, that, and signs that had places where the Jews used to live. And it's, I guess there's nothing like being there in person to evoke, in me, the grief of being there, realizing that these people are no longer there, and watching that life has gone on, and it's almost like nobody seems to notice. And that was an incredible, renewed feeling I had just about a month ago being there. And I think it makes us all think about conservation and saving, you know, for extinction and different things, because life just seems to go on. And we've talked to somebody who had a place next door to one of the synagogues. She had no idea. And it was like, it's like they've just wiped away, and life goes on. And I think that this is,
exactly.
But I think only a Jew is going to feel the grief. I don't know, but I mean, I think it's interesting. You're saying, well, they're interested, the response you're getting is historically interesting, but grief, that feeling of loss, is of the people themselves who really have their historical life affected.
Well,
People hear that?
I tend to agree with you. On the other hand, I know, and I think if you read the little introduction that I mentioned in this book, I know that young people feel a tremendous loss. It's not personal grief, perhaps, but it's shame, and it's also people in Germany and Poland, for example, young people feel they have been deprived, I've had this said to me, of a multicultural society that they know nothing about, and they feel they've lost something. And I found that an interesting and totally sincere kind of comment, like almost envy, you know, like I wish we still had that kind of thing, you know. But it's not grief, you're right, yeah.
Susan Hiller, thank you very much. Thank you for coming, everybody.